So I often get asked, what happens when you compromise in a negotiation? Today, I'm actually going to discuss some common misunderstandings that most people have about compromise and its role in negotiation. And I'm also going to share how to avoid unnecessary compromises by turning issues that seem conflicting into sources of mutual gain in negotiation. First, let me start with this common wrong-headed assumption about negotiation. You see, most people think negotiation is about compromise. And I gotta tell you, it is one of the things that drives me crazy. Because any negotiation expert will tell you that negotiation is not primarily about compromise. That is a complete misunderstanding of what negotiation is. Because in fact, most negotiations actually have opportunities where the parties can create additional value by moving beyond their positions to their underlying interests. And when we think about underlying interests, it is the case that one of the ways in which we reach a good outcome is by meeting our own interests well and the other side's at least acceptably. And if we're meeting interests, we're really not compromising. So the classic example, and some of you probably have heard this example, is the story of two sisters and they're fighting over the last orange in the house. And at some point, mom intervenes, and because she is a kind mom who is fair-minded, she cuts the orange in half. And one sister takes her half, and she peels the orange, and she eats the fruit, and she throws the peel away. And so this looks so far like a good outcome. And it's a good outcome because the sisters aren't fighting anymore, and it's based on a principle of equity. But then things go really downhill, right? Because the other sister takes her half, and she peels it, and she throws the fruit away, and she uses the peel for the zest in a cake she's baking. And so what we see here is this paradigmatic example of why negotiation is not primarily about compromise. Because yes, splitting the orange in half obviously made it work for both sisters, but you threw away a huge amount of value because it wasn't based on the sisters' interests. One wanted the orange and the other wanted the peel. And so what I want to say is that really good negotiators don't go into a negotiation thinking, oh, I don't want to compromise too much, or I hope I don't have to make many compromises. But rather, they go into the negotiation thinking, what are my underlying interests? What might their underlying interests be? And how can I find creative ways to meet those interests? Now, I don't want to be naive, because every negotiation does have some compromises. But the notion that it's mostly about compromise is wrong-headed. So what does that mean? Well, that means that in addition to moving from positions to interests, I also want to look for differences that exist between the parties, differences between myself and the other side that might help us exploit those sources of value. So when I say differences, what are the kinds of things that I have in my mind? Well, it might be a difference about a prediction about the future, or it might be a difference in a risk profile, or it might be a difference in our relative valuation, or it might be a difference in resource and capability. So let me give you an example, one that I was involved with some months ago. So I was mediating a labor management dispute in a very large company. And one of the issues that got particularly stuck, not surprisingly, was around the union's demand for wage increases and management's reluctance to give them. So this is an issue that it seems like is zero-sum wage increases and where there's going to have to be compromise. Now, chances are there do need to be some compromise here. Right below the surface was the issue of what did the wage increase mean? And as we all know, we have lived over the past year and a half in a time of increasing inflation, particularly around food prices. It turned out that this employer actually had a very, very large food operation as part of its business, Moreover, it was also the case that every single day, huge amounts of food were going to waste. The food wasn't being purchased and it wasn't available the next day. So by thinking about one of the issues embedded in the salary was the ability of employees to deal with increases in food prices, there was a very elegant solution. If this employer made lunch available to all of its employees for free, and then allowed workers the opportunity to take unused food home at the end of the day, it would exploit a difference between the parties. And the difference specifically was around relative valuation. The food was extremely valuable to the employees, and the reality is the employer had already spent the money on it and the food was going to go to waste. Now, to be clear, that issue itself didn't obviate some compromise needed around the wage increase, but it did take away some of the issues related to compromise. And there are all sorts of examples here of when we see an issue that seems like there needs to be compromise, and then actually move to the interest and actually think about differences between the parties, whether around, again, relative cost or risk preference, we can find ways to structure the deal that reduce or sometimes eliminate compromise needs entirely. Okay, so now we're in a situation where we ultimately do need to do some compromise. One way we can compromise is by strong-arming each other, using our leverage to force the other side to make bigger compromises that are more meaningful to them while I make small ones. But a better way, a best practice, is to actually look to external standards of legitimacy or criteria as a way to understand what would be a fair-minded compromise. A compromise that either side could explain to their constituency or to their boss that doesn't make me or the other side look weak or that they're caving in. So let me give you an example, not involving money, but a different kind of compromise. So many years ago, when I first started teaching negotiation, I was working with another neophyte, another colleague, and we were both planning a course together. And we were trying to agree upon how we should teach a particular set of concepts. And unfortunately, we were not seeing eye to eye on it. And so ultimately, we had to make a compromise. We had a shared interest, which was deliver a really good course, but we had different ideas of what that would look like. So how do we resolve that? One way is that one of us could have dug in, and said, it's my way or the highway. But instead, what we did is we both had the same negotiation teacher when we were in law school. And we both thought she was an outstanding teacher. And so for us, we thought she was a fair criteria, that we would happily defer to whatever she said. And so we basically agreed that we would ask her how we should teach this unit, and whatever she said, we would do. And so that was a really nice and elegant way to make a compromise, because it was identifying a criteria or a standard of legitimacy that both of us felt was fair and resonant. The reality is that at times there are compromises in negotiation, but compromises occur far less frequently than we think they do, and really good negotiators try to avoid the notion of compromise by thinking about what are my interests instead of positions, what are their interests instead of positions. They then use that as a way to brainstorm creative options. They also look to differences that exist between the parties, differences in predictions about the future, around relative resources and capabilities, around risk preferences, and they can therefore eliminate or reduce the level of compromise required. And when there is compromise, they can actually look to criteria or shared norms as a way to bridge the gap. So, to continue your own learning about negotiation, please watch this next video, which is how do I negotiate when the other side has more power? And I would be incredibly grateful if you would subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Please like this video, and so that you don't miss new videos when they come here, and they come here 3 times a week, just ring the bell and then you'll be notified. Okay, you want to know how to get more power?